There are episodes in my chronicles of Mr. Sherlock Holmes so rhymed with frost, so shadowed by whispers of a family curse, that I long delayed setting them to paper. Even a physician's steadier nerves may flutter when winter itself seems to play the murderer. It was in the iron weeks of midwinter, when London's fog lay yellow and low, that a summons reached us at Baker Street, not of stolen jewels nor state papers, but of a young bride found at dawn in a locked conservatory, seated as if for her vows, her veil turned to glass. What followed drew Holmes and me into a household where superstition was made to serve calculation, where a breath of bitter almonds spoke more truly than a legend, and where ice, ribbon, and shadow were marshalled to counterfeit the very hand of death. This is the case I record as Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Frozen Bride. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing to the channel and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Veil at the Window. It was upon a morning of peculiar brilliance after a night of hard frost that I sat opposite Sherlock Holmes at breakfast, watching him tease a melody from his violin with the bow held idly in his left hand, and the fork, absurdly, in his right. He had eaten with the same listless inattention with which he now played, a sure sign that his mind, for once, had no appropriate quarry. "Watson," said he suddenly, laying down both fork and bow, "we are to have a visitor who dislikes London carriages, keeps early hours, and has sat up all night with someone in distress." I had heard nothing from the street, but even as I turned, the bell was rung with a firmness that confirmed his prophecy. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a lady heavily veiled and muffled in sable. She remained standing, her gloved hands clasped tight upon a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "You are Mr. Holmes. I am Lydia Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell, of Ashfield House, Hampstead. Pray forgive the hour. There has been a death." Her voice did not falter, but it possessed that tension which speaks of long pressure and a recent release. Holmes indicated the chair by the fire and placed brandy within her reach. "Not your own physician, I note," said he gently. "You have brought us a problem, not a consolation. Let us have it out plain. The problem, Mr. Holmes, is my daughter, my stepdaughter, Miss Eleanor Hartwell. She is to have been married this very day to Captain Roland St. Clair. Last night, after a small family supper, she vanished. We found her at dawn in the conservatory, dead." The lady's hands trembled upon the parcel. "They say she looked like a bride carved from ice." Holmes's eyes grew intent. "The police?" "Inspector Gregson has been most attentive. There is talk of a chill taken in the night. The conservatory was locked from within. But—" She lifted the paper and exposed a veil of exquisite Chantilly lace, its edges glazed with a brittle whiteness. "This was caught upon the inner latch, as if dragged through the keyhole. And, Mr. Holmes, there was an odour, a faint one. Almonds." The last word hung in the air between us, like the ding of a glass tapped by a knife. I saw the quick flash in Holmes's eye that tells of a chord struck in memory. "Pray compose yourself, madam," said he. "You have done wisely to come. We shall go to Ashfield at once. Leave the veil and your candour with us." She departed shortly thereafter, and Holmes stood at the window, watching the cab retreat into the maze of morning traffic. He held the veil to the light, examining the frost-stiffened edges with that peculiar intensity which told me his faculties were now fully engaged. The listlessness of the breakfast hour had vanished as completely as smoke up a chimney. A locked room, Watson, and the scent of bitter almonds. The former is always intriguing. The latter is invariably ominous. We have before us a problem that wears the costume of accident, but speaks, I think, in the accent of design. So began for us a day whose chill no fire could quite dispel, and a mystery in which the frost upon the glass was the least of the things that bit cold. Chapter 2. The house of white, Breath Ashfield House stood in a clutch of firs upon the slope above Hampstead, its stone front darkened by weather, and its windows crowded with ferns against the winter glare. A local superstition, of which we heard from our cabman before the gate had closed behind us, named a bride's pool in the grounds, and spoke of a white figure that walked upon frost nights. But Holmes, with that impatience he reserved for folklore, brushed it away with a flick of his gloved fingers. The dead do not walk, Watson, though the living may dress themselves in their legends. Let us attend to what can be measured and weighed. Inspector Gregson met us in the hall, a competent fellow whom we had found as ready to accept instruction as to give it. He was a man of the new school, practical and unimaginative, but with a doggedness that served him well in simpler cases. "Death by exposure, likely," said he, leading us through passages hung with portraits of stern-faced Hartwells, doors and roof vent fastened on the inside, no marks of violence, a tragic sleep in a cold room, Mr. Holmes, and nothing more sinister than a young woman's unfortunate choice of refuge. "We shall see," said Holmes. "The facts first, if you please, and the theories after." The conservatory lay at the rear of the house, a glass-roofed chamber that opened from the morning room. Holmes knelt at the threshold before we entered, examining the stone flags with his lens. They were pearled with frozen dew. Each fern frond bore delicate needles of ice that caught the pale sunlight like crystal beads. In the centre, upon a wicker settee beneath a drooping palm, Miss Eleanor Hartwell lay in her bridal gown. The dress was of ivory satin, simply cut but elegant, and her dark hair lay unbound upon her shoulders. A white camellia bouquet had fallen at her side, its petals edged with frost. Her lips were tinged blue, and an odd, faint smile hovered there. No taint of agony, rather a resignation that struck me with peculiar sadness, as though she had greeted some expected visitor and found him not unkind. The air held a reticent scent, so slight that I doubted it until I caught it again. The ghost of bitter almonds. Holmes bent over the latch of the inner door, which opened to the garden path. "You found it thus, Gregson?" "Barred and bolted, Mr. Holmes. We had to force the outer door from the morning room. The key was on the inside, the bolt shot home." "Indeed." Holmes produced a small rule from his pocket and measured the escutcheon with the precision of a jeweller. With his lens he inspected the keyhole itself, then straightened. "Watson, a hairpin, if you please. You will find some in the dressing-table of the ante-room." I fetched one, though I could not fathom his purpose. With infinite delicacy, he passed it through the keyhole and withdrew it. Upon the tip there clung a tiny thread of white. "Lace," said he softly, holding it to the light. "And here—" He touched the inner plate of the lock. A smear of lamp-black, no doubt from a candle snuffed with a sooty finger. Someone wished to see, by the mark it left, how the bolt lay. Gregson frowned. "But the room was shut, tight as a drum, Mr. Holmes." "The room was made to appear shut," Holmes returned. "That is a different matter entirely." We examined the unfortunate girl with such respect as the situation demanded. There was no bruise upon her, save a tiny crescent on the inside of the left wrist, scarcely more than a pressure mark, as if someone had gripped her there, or perhaps rubbed the skin. Holmes sniffed the fallen bouquet with care, then wrapped both flowers and the veil Mrs. Hartwell had brought in his paper, and consigned them to his coat pocket. "The household, Gregson. I should like to see them assembled." The drawing-room fire had been lit against the morning chill, and there we met the remaining members of Ashfield's small company. Mrs. Lydia Hartwell herself was a handsome woman in her middle years, composed to a fault, with dark eyes that seemed to calculate even as they expressed appropriate grief. Captain Roland St. Clair, the intended bridegroom, was a tall officer with a scar across his cheek and the frank, open manner of the service. His distress was genuine and unguarded. Mr. Arthur Hartwell, a cousin of the deceased, proved a pale, thin-lipped young man with a clerk's stoop and eyes that slid away from direct regard. Finally, there was Jory Pike, the gardener, a weather-beaten fellow whose chapped hands and straw-coloured beard gave him the look of a man in whom the winter had made its dwelling. The stories they told agreed upon the essentials: a quiet supper the previous evening, Miss Hartwell retiring early with a headache, no one seen to enter or leave the conservatory, and a house asleep while the frost set its hand upon every pane. The body had been discovered by Mrs. Hartwell herself shortly after dawn, when she had gone to cut flowers for the wedding breakfast. Yet upon each narrative Holmes contrived to lay a finger that made it quiver. He asked of chimneys and vents, of the ice house by the old lake, of fisheries that required blocks of stored ice even in winter, of the furnace that warmed the palm house, and, almost as an afterthought, of who had trimmed the wicks in the conservatory lamps the previous evening. It was Pike who answered that last. "No lamps were lit there last night, sir. The room keeps its own breath, it do. Cold as a tomb in winter, hot as Hades in summer." Holmes's glance moved to the man's cracked knuckles. "And yours, my friend, keep the look of salt. You have been shifting ice." Pike nodded slowly. "From the ice house to the scullery, sir, to keep the fish fresh for today's wedding breakfast." He faltered. "God save us. There'll be no wedding now." "When did you fetch this ice?" Holmes asked, his tone casual. "In the small hours, sir. 2 o'clock, perhaps, or thereabouts, by Madam's order, to preserve the salmon." With that, the mournful business of the house seemed to draw breath and weight, for we all felt, I think, that Holmes's questions were the points of a net, and something living had begun to feel them tighten. Chapter 3. The White Lady. The Black Ledger. In every country house there is a room where the family history gathers to itself, portraits in oil whose varnish has darkened to amber, a sword or two crossed above the mantel, a miniature whose painted eyes seem to follow the visitor. At Ashfield it was the music-room, and we had scarce stepped within when Mrs. Hartwell, with a composure that verged upon defiance, recounted the legend that had troubled the neighbourhood. "It is an old Hampshire tale transplanted to London gossip," said she, standing before a portrait of a woman in Restoration dress. 2 centuries ago, a Hartwell bride vanished upon her wedding morning and was found by the bride's pool, made white by frost and by malice. They call it a curse. I call it a memory upon which idle minds hang accidents. You will not find me its slave, Mr. Holmes." Holmes bowed slightly. "Superstition is the art of making the inexplicable comfortable, madam. I prefer the uncomfortable facts." "And what facts have you discovered?" "Very few as yet. But I collect them as a gardener collects cuttings. One never knows which will take root." He turned to the captain, who stood with military straightness by the window. "Captain St. Clair, your regiment?" "The 107th Foot, lately returned from India, sir." "And your finances, if I may be so indelicate." The soldier's jaw hardened. "Sir." Come. No offence intended. I note a pawnbroker's ticket, Cockspur Street, visible in your card case when you removed your calling card earlier. A sapphire cufflink lodged 3 days past, unless I miss my guess. A young officer's income is a tight shoe for a wedding of this size. It is natural you should ease it where you can." St. Clair flushed, then laughed shortly, the tension breaking. "You play fair, Mr. Holmes, even when the game is painful. My means are at their lowest ebb, I confess it. But Miss Hartwell and I were to have had her settlement upon our marriage. We should have done very well." "Quite so." Holmes's head inclined thoughtfully, then turned. "Mr. Arthur Hartwell, I understand you stood to gain certain properties should your cousin remain unmarried." Arthur, who had been studying his boots with unseemly concentration, met Holmes's gaze with a peculiar lightness. "A small estate in Shropshire, sir, barely profitable, and entailed in any case. I shall not dance upon my cousin's grave for such a trifle." "And you, Mrs. Hartwell," said Holmes at last, his voice gentle but inexorable. "You lose the management of your late husband's affairs upon your stepdaughter's marriage, do you not?" Her eyes met his as steel meets flint. "I lose a daughter, Mr. Holmes. That is burden enough for any woman to carry." There was a silence, broken only by the settling of coals in the grate. Then Holmes requested permission to survey the grounds, and we departed the close air of the music-room for the sharper cold without. The bride's pool lay a little way from the house, beyond a stand of naked elms. Its surface was skimmed with ice like a dark eye, half-lidded, and the reeds at its margin stood brittle as blown glass. The legend seemed less absurd here, where the winter had pressed its thumb upon every living thing. Beyond the pool crouched a low, turf-roofed structure of ancient brick, the ice-house. Holmes opened the heavy door, and we descended 3 stone steps into a chamber that pinched the nostrils with its cold. Blocks of winter-seized river water were stacked about a central pit, and the floor was scattered with coarse salt that would burn the skin if touched carelessly. Holmes stood very still, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. The long ascetic face was as blank as a slate awaiting chalk. "Watson," said he at last, "note the grit upon my glove." He showed me the palm, where salt crystals glittered. "And this?" He bent and lifted, with finger and thumb, a carelessly looped length of pale satin ribbon from near the threshold. "New cut, from a woman's work basket, with a burr of lace caught upon one end." "Very good." He replaced it exactly where it had lain, marking the spot with his eye. In the scullery, a stone-flagged room, warm with the heat of the great stove, the cook, a red-armed woman of comfortable proportions, confirmed Pike's statement regarding the ice. It had been fetched in the small hours, by order. "Whose order?" Holmes asked. The woman glanced uneasily toward the passage, then at Mrs. Hartwell's lady's maid, who stood wringing her hands by the door. "Madam's order, sir," the maid whispered. Mrs. Hartwell herself came down near 2 o'clock and bade Pike fetch ice for the fish, and— She hesitated. And, Holmes prompted. And to scatter some in the conservatory, sir, to keep the ferns from blackening with the frost. She said the furnace had been left too high, and the sudden cold would damage them. Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally, but he made no comment. By the time a bleared sun had rolled above the firs, Holmes had also contrived to examine the housekeeper's room, a neat chamber smelling of lavender and beeswax. From beneath a ledger of household accounts, he drew, like a fish from shadow, a narrow book bound in black morocco. He did not open it in my presence, but merely weighed it in his hand, as a man weighs a possibility, then returned it to its place with care. These family houses, he observed as we crossed the hall toward the waiting cab, are like the cabinets at the British Museum. 1,000 little drawers. The art lies in knowing which to pull. That evening, back at Baker Street with the veil and bouquet spread before him on the table, my friend set about one of those homely experiments which, by their very simplicity, often yielded the most damning results. From the camellia petals, he washed a minute quantity of liquid into a watch-glass, added a few crystals from a labelled bottle upon his chemical shelf, and smiled when the contents blushed the faintest blue. The bitter almond odour was not an illusion, Watson. Hydrocyanic acid, prussic acid as the old chemists had it, in trace amounts such as ladies sometimes keep in their cabinets for nervous complaints, or gardeners misuse upon greenfly and aphids. Present in the bouquet, and I suspect administered more directly as well. The freezing of the room was mere theatre. The death itself was chemical, swift, and, to one who knew where to look, unmistakable. He sat back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, gazing into the fire. Outside, the frost wrote its runes upon our window once more, and I felt the case grow colder, even as our hearth burned bright. Pow Chapter 4. Holmes in Disguise, and the Thread Through the Keyhole. The following day, Holmes vanished after an early breakfast, leaving me with no more than a cryptic note pinned to the mantelpiece. The seedsman will return by luncheon. Hold the fort. S.H. True to his promise, there stumped into Ashfield's kitchen yard, as I watched from my post in the shrubbery, a country hawker of bulbs and packets. He wore a smock stained with honest earth, possessed a pronounced stoop, and spoke with a rural burr that would have deceived his own mother. His nose was reddened by what might have been ale or weather, or both, and he carried his samples in a basket of the sort seen at every market garden gate. It was Holmes to the last freckle, and I marvelled once again at his chameleonic gift. He spent a full hour gossiping with Pike the gardener beside the tool shed, discussing the virtues of manure and the perfidy of slugs. Another hour he passed in the scullery, where he sold the cook a packet of seeds so absurdly mislabelled, Parisian turnips for what were clearly radishes, that I nearly gave away his disguise with my laughter. But he learned much, I had no doubt, for Holmes in his disguises had a way of loosening tongues that his own keen face never could. When we rejoined in a lane behind the firs, out of sight of the house, he cast off his shapeless cap and grinned like a schoolboy released from lessons. "Our Mr. Pike," said he, dusting flour from his sleeve, "is a simple instrument, Watson, and has been played upon by a more cunning hand. He was indeed sent for ice at 2 o'clock, precisely as we suspected. He was told to scatter it liberally in the conservatory, ostensibly to preserve the ferns from blackening, a reason at once plausible to a gardener and scientifically asinine. He obeyed without question. He also, at Madam's express direction, opened the roof vent to its fullest extent and turned off the furnace that warms the Palm House pipes. The result is the fairy grotto we admired yesterday, a room transformed into a frozen bower. But if the ice was brought at 2 o'clock, the lady had been dead for an hour at least when the ice arrived, Holmes said quietly. That much is certain. The prussic acid trace in the bouquet is sufficient evidence, but there is more. Do you recall the tiny mark upon the inside of her wrist? I do. A mere crescent, as if from a fingernail, or from a finger rubbing the skin to aid the absorption of a liquid applied there. Prussic acid acts with remarkable speed when introduced through the delicate skin of the wrist or neck. A drop upon the lips, another rubbed upon that thin skin, the victim would have felt faint within moments, perhaps attributing it to her headache. She sat, breathing the cold night air through the unlatched vent, and the end came with that gentle smile we noted. No struggle, no cry, merely a quiet surrender that might easily be mistaken for sleep. Afterwards, our artificer rehearsed the ghost, frost, lace veil, locked door, and all the machinery of impossibility. The ribbon you mentioned, from the ice house? He drew from his pocket both the length of satin ribbon he had found and a piece of the Chantilly lace veil. Observe, Watson, the veil is strong for all its delicacy. It was fed through the keyhole, no great feat as the aperture is generous in these old locks, and used as a leader to draw this ribbon about the bolt knob inside. But how to know when the bolt was properly engaged? Simplicity itself. A smudge of lamp black was first dabbed upon the inner plate, positioned so that when the bolt slid home, it would leave its mark upon the black. Our artificer, peering through the keyhole by candlelight, would see the bright scratch of metal appear in the soot, and know the deed was done. A pull, a twitch to free the ribbon, and the veil itself catches upon the latch as it is withdrawn. A detail not intended, I think, but one which Providence supplied to lead us toward the truth. The method is neat, quiet, and I venture to say, demoniacally feminine in its combination of household craft and murderous purpose. Then you are certain it was Mrs. Hartwell? Holmes's face was grave as he gazed back towards the house, its chimneys just visible above the dark firs. The facts point one way, Watson, but the law requires more than a pointing finger. We must have the hand that held the poison bottle. Consider motive. Upon Miss Hartwell's marriage, the widow's control of the estate and its income would have ended entirely. The settlement would pass to the bride and her husband. Our worthy captain, though poor, is transparently honest. No tool for embezzlement there. Mr. Arthur gains his entailed property only if the marriage fails and the lady subsequently dies unwed, a contingency too remote and conditional to justify such risk. But the settlement itself— Ah, Watson, there is the key that unlocks this particular door. He tapped his pocket where the black ledger presumably still rested. That book I found contains entries in Mrs. Hartwell's own hand, recording what she delicately terms temporary loans from Miss Hartwell's trust, sums which were to be accounted for and returned upon the wedding day. To a soul that loves power and has tasted the freedom of unchecked control, the prospect of deprivation and audit is a spur sharper than any debt. Add to that the discovery, which I believe Miss Hartwell had recently made, of these appropriations, and we have a motive both powerful and immediate. Then you will accuse her directly. I shall invite her to correct my reasoning, said he, with a thin smile. But first, one final proof. Not for the court, perhaps, but for my own conscience. He opened his other hand to show a minute shred of lace caught upon a wooden splinter, and with it a few grains of what appeared to be fine, dark powder. This I took from the door frame of the ice house. Lace matches the veil precisely. You may verify it with your lens. The powder is cosmetic, the sort ladies use to shadow their brows or darken their lashes. Our ghost, Watson, walked twice that night, from house to ice house, to fetch the ribbon and prepare her stage, and back again to execute her tableau. She left salt upon her hem from the ice house floor, lace upon the burr in the door frame, and this powder transferred from her face to the veil when she drew it through the keyhole. There is an economy in crime, as there is in nature. Both leave their waste, and the wise investigator knows where to look for it. By dusk he had dispatched a telegram to Inspector Gregson, requesting that the household be assembled once more in the music room. I spent the intervening hours attempting to compose my notes, but found my hand shaking slightly as I wrote. There is something peculiarly chilling in a murder disguised as mercy from winter, as if the season itself had been made accomplice to human malice. When we returned to Ashfield as the lamps were being lit, the fire in the music room had been built high, and the portraits seemed to lean inward from their frames, as if to hear judgment passed. Outside, the white breath of evening mist moved against the windows, and within, a sense of ending hung upon the cornices like a final chord awaiting its resolution. Chapter 5. The Bride. Unfrozen. We stood before the hearth in a tableau that might have been arranged by some sardonic painter of domestic scenes. Holmes, erect and pale as a rapier. Inspector Gregson, solid and businesslike, with the quiet confidence of a man who knows an arrest is at hand. And the three principal members of the household, each a study in apprehension. Mrs. Hartwell sat with her hands folded in her lap, her composure intact, but something watchful in her eyes. Captain St. Clair stood behind her chair, one hand upon its back, his scarred face drawn with grief and confusion. Mr. Arthur Hartwell occupied the window seat, pale as parchment, his clerk's fingers plucking at his trouser seam. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "we are here to lay a ghost and to do justice to a lady whose only fault was trust and obedience. The newspapers, when they learn of this case, will doubtless call it a curse revived, the bride's pool claiming another victim after 2 centuries of slumber. It is nothing of the sort. It is simpler and more sordid than any legend, a matter of ribbon, lamp-black, prussic acid, and money." He paused, and in that pause I heard the settling of coals and the faint whisper of wind at the casement. Then he spoke again, laying out the case as a surgeon might lay out his instruments, each fact clean, sharp, and purposeful. He told them of the bouquet and its infinitesimal burden of poison, of the faint scent of bitter almonds that had first alerted his suspicions, of the tiny pressure mark upon the inside of Miss Hartwell's wrist, where the skin had been rubbed to hasten absorption. He described the conservatory vent, opened to admit the night's killing cold, and the ice trundled in hours after death to counterfeit a freezing that had never occurred. He explained the mechanism of the locked door, the lace veil drawn through the generous keyhole. The ribbon looped about the bolt, the smear of lamp black that betrayed a watcher's careful eye. From his pockets he produced the evidence, like a conjurer producing cards. The shred of lace from the keyhole, matched precisely to the veil, the salt crystals from a hem sample he had taken, the ribbon from the icehouse threshold, the cosmetic powder that had transferred from face to fabric. And finally, the small black ledger, which he opened to show entries in a feminine hand, temporary loans that mounted, page by page, into a sum that could not easily be explained or repaid. The trust was to be audited and transferred this very morning, Holmes said, his finger resting upon the final entry. Miss Hartwell, I believe, had begun to ask questions, the sort of questions that an honest heart asks when it perceives irregularity. Captain St. Clair, your poverty is transparent and honourable. You would have been no party to deception. Mr. Arthur, your inheritance was too distant and conditional to tempt a rational mind to murder. But you, madam— He turned, and his gaze settled upon Mrs. Hartwell with the weight of absolute certainty. You alone had both motive and opportunity. You ordered the ice, fetched and scattered. You knew the household's rhythms and the trick of the old locks. You had access to your stepdaughter's cabinet, where a small medicinal bottle of prussic acid, prescribed, I believe, for nervous headaches, is now conspicuously absent. And you alone stood to profit immediately and entirely by Miss Hartwell's death, for with her gone, the trust remains in your sole control, and the audit dies with the auditor. There was a silence then in which the house itself seemed to lean and listen. Mrs. Hartwell's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her eyes moved not to Holmes, but to the remnant of lace veil upon the table, as if to some pet creature that had turned and bitten her. You cannot prove that I touched her, she said at last, so low that I barely heard it. You cannot prove I administered anything. Holmes inclined his head with something like respect. Nor need I prove the precise moment of administration, madam. The Crown will construct its own road to that conclusion, guided by the facts I have laid before Inspector Gregson. But there are witnesses enough to your movements. The gardener whom you sent for ice will testify at what hour you gave your orders and bade him open the vent. The scullery maid will confirm your presence in the house at the crucial time. The ledger speaks for itself. As for the missing file, Gregson. The inspector, who had been waiting with the patience of a hound at point, produced from his coat pocket a small glass bottle sealed with red wax. The label, though faded, was legible even from where I stood. Acid, hydrocyan. Dill, use with caution. Found in Madam's writing desk an hour ago, Mr. Holmes, tucked beneath the blotter. A drop or two remaining. Sufficient for analysis. The apothecary's record will show it was dispensed to Miss Eleanor Hartwell 6 months past, and the bottle never returned to her cabinet. Mrs. Hartwell swayed slightly, caught herself upon the arm of her chair, and sat very still. There was not a cry from her, nor a tear, only a terrible composure that seemed itself a kind of arctic waste. When Gregson at last stepped forward and laid a hand upon her shoulder, she rose without resistance and permitted herself to be led toward the door. Her step was steady, her back straight. She might have been going to some tedious appointment rather than to the dock and the noose. At the threshold she paused and looked back, not at Holmes or Gregson, but at the portrait of the Restoration bride above the mantel. She, too, was a Hartwell, she said, as if to herself. They say she understood what it meant to lose everything. Then she was gone, and the door closed with a sound like a book shut upon a finished chapter. Captain St. Clair stood with his head bowed, his hands clenched at his sides. For a long moment he said nothing, and I thought he might break down entirely. Then he drew a long breath and looked at Holmes with eyes that held both grief and gratitude. "She was all goodness," he whispered. "Eleanor was all goodness, Mr. Holmes. She would have forgiven even this." Holmes's hand, which so rarely offered comfort, touched the young man's shoulder with a gentleness I had seen only seldom in all our years together. "Goodness is not armor, Captain. It is light. It shows us things as they are, without shadow or flattery. Your duty now is to carry that light forward, not to curse the night that tried to extinguish it. She would have wished you to live well, and that is a command more binding than any deathbed promise." The soldier nodded slowly, then turned away toward the window, where the last of the daylight was fading into winter dusk. Later that evening, as we sat once more in the familiar comfort of Baker Street and watched the frost return to write anew upon our window panes, I found myself attempting to settle the residue of the case in my mind. Holmes had thrown himself into his chair with that curious exhaustion that always followed the resolution of a problem. Not physical weariness, but rather the emptiness of a mind suddenly bereft of purpose. He lit his pipe and sat smoking in silence, the blue wreaths rising toward the ceiling like ghosts of thought. "You were certain from the first?" I asked at length. "From the moment she mentioned the scent of almonds?" "I was suspicious from that moment," he corrected, his eyes half closed. "Certainty is a poor traveller without companions, Watson. It prefers to go in company with motive, means, and method, and it likes above all to be invited rather than assumed. But yes, the almond scent is singular. It speaks of only one substance, and that substance does not occur in nature at a bride's deathbed without human agency. The locked room was misdirection, theatrical, and clever, but ultimately beside the point. The true mystery was never how she was trapped, but why she was killed, and by whom. Once those questions found their answers, the mechanism of the door became mere footnote. He fell silent again, and I thought of that light he had named in speaking to the bereaved captain, the light of goodness that shows things plain. It seemed to me then that Holmes himself carried such a light, though he would have scorned the comparison. His was the colder illumination of reason, perhaps, but no less valuable for that. It shone into dark corners where softer lights feared to reach, and it asked no reward save the satisfaction of truth revealed. Outside, the frost continued its silent work, etching patterns upon glass that would melt with morning. But the pattern Holmes had traced would remain in the records of Scotland Yard and in the memory of those who had known Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a pattern of innocence betrayed and justice, however belatedly, served. Thus ended the matter of the frozen bride, and with it one of the colder winters of my remembrance, a case in which the icicles were not all upon the eaves, and the killing hand not all of flesh and blood, but of greed and fear, made manifest in salt, ribbon, and poison carefully applied. There are cases I have recorded for their ingenuity, and others for their romance. This one I keep for the lesson it pressed upon me with the cold of that winter dawn. Frost may pass for the hand of death, a veil for a lock, and a legend for the alibi of common greed. Holmes asked only for the plainest facts, and with his patient art brushed the glitter from each deception until the pattern stood bare. If there is comfort in the matter, it lies in the small, stubborn lamp of reason he bears, steady enough to thaw the prettiest lies into mere water. Thus ended the affair of the frozen bride, and with it another reminder that appearances are the most dangerous of accomplices. Holmes, who heard me say as much, only smiled. The world, my dear Watson, is full of very pretty disguises. It is as well to keep a match ready. If this tale captured you, I invite you to subscribe for more untold cases of Sherlock Holmes, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Until the next case, keep your lamp burning, and beware the fog.